Hello and welcome to section 2. Section 2, we're going to start getting into more of the functionality of the project. The first thing I want to do is start setting up our game data. So if you've followed any of my other tutorials, we've touched on this game data probably a couple of times. But it's a really good setup for it's sort of a replacement for having multiple game modes. And before we kick into that, I just wanted to discuss data assets and what their benefits are and why you might want to use them. So the first thing we really need to look at is there's two types of data assets that I'm aware of. There's the normal U data asset and there's the U primary data asset. Unreal Engine has two types of assets in general. So there's primary and secondary assets. By default, only U world assets are classed as primary assets and all other assets are secondary. So they behave as all assets do, that they're not loaded unless they're referenced. Their secondary data assets are not handled by the asset manager. And that's the main difference between the primary data asset and the data asset, is that the primary data asset is handled by the asset manager. It uses the primary data asset ID to allow us to manipulate the primary data assets via the asset manager, so we can load and unload the assets as we need to. One that always comes up, and I've had a few questions about it, and to be honest, I've never been able to answer it in the past, but I had to look into it, and it's primary data assets versus data tables. And the only real benefit I can see over data tables, because they're very similar, there's a bit of overlap in different areas, but the primary data assets, a data table, if you have a very large data table, like you're talking thousands of rows, when you go to look up a single row, it has to load that whole data table to access that row, whereas a primary data asset, you can just load that single data asset and look at it. Whether it's a big benefit or not, like I've got nothing against data tables. They've got their uses. I find them a bit annoying to use, but that's maybe because I've put a lot of time into learning primary data assets and I know how they work now and find them awesome. So back to the game data. So the game data will be a primary data asset, and that allows us to load it whenever we want. We'll use the primary data asset to define the parameters of our game, and for lack of a better name, our game mode. Each sort of game mode that we have in our game. So if you look at an RTS, say like you might have capture and hold, or you might have just domination or something. They're two different game modes. You can just have two different data assets that have. We could have a single data asset class that has different settings on it, but when they're filtered, like you can tick a box in the UI and it only filters it'll only show the data assets that have that tick box ticked and things like that. And that's probably the other main benefit of data assets is when it comes to displaying data in UI and stuff, there's some strong benefits for using data assets. It makes it really easy to display lists and stuff. So. And I've covered the uListView class. If you haven't used the ListView class before, what it does is when you've got a whole heap of assets, it only loads what's in view. So it sort of loads a couple out, but essentially anything that's in view is loaded, and you can just scroll through a mega list and it's just loading those assets as they come up. And it's very optimized. Let's start in the game mode and we'll add some projected functions here. So the first one we're going to add is game data. And we're going to have another one called handle game data assignment. Implement those. Init game data will just call on the game state. So game state here. I'm going to change how that initiates, but we'll do that when we get to the game phase section. But in init game data, we just want to delay a frame to allow the game state to be fully initialized and anything that has to do in initialization. So what we're going to do is we're just going to check we've got a world by this point, but it's just good practice. So get world. We want to get the time manager. We're going to set a timer for next tick. And then we're going to pass game mode as the object and use the macro of this class, and we're going to call the handle game data assignment. So that'll just call the handle game data, and we'll put a reminder in here. We're doing this because we want to wait for things to initialize. Now in our handle game data assignment, this is where we need to handle all entries to the game mode. We're either going to be reading the game data from the options string, or we're going to have to look up some sort of default game data to load the game as we would. So if you think of the game loading for the first time, we want to load the menu and the player can choose what they want to do. Whereas the second time it loads, we're probably clicked host game or start game and we want to load straight into a game, but we still need the game data. So this is what the two differences are here. So one option will be to check that we have multiplayer data basically. The other one is to fall back to a default game data. And then obviously if we don't find anything, we'll log an error or something like that. So now we need a variable for the game data. So I'm going to put that in here, and we're going to call this it's going to be a primary asset. So this is our actual, and it's going to be just our current game data. So then copy that, we'll go back into our handle here. We want to check if it's not assigned that current game data. Sorry, I'm just going to change that variable to current game data asset ID. We're sort of going to have two types. There's going to be the asset ID and there's going to be the actual game data when you cast it to the class that you really want to distinguish between the two. So this is the ID, and so if that's not valid, we want to do this check, and we also want to say see if option string has options. If it doesn't have any options, there's no point going in there. Statics is what I'm after. This has a function to basically check has the options string got options. And then we need to enter the name of the option string. So the way the option string works, it's a string for the name and then a string for the value. So it's like a pair, like a key, it says there in the description. The key is something that we're going to want to perhaps reference multiple times and we don't want to stuff it up. So it's just an F name. What we're going to do is we're going to create another class inside framework. And I'm going to just create a folder in here, and we're going to call it data. And then in here, we're just going to create a file, and we're just going to call it RTS core static game data. So this is where we're going to .h, where we're going to put our defines. So the one that we want to do is multiplayer settings. And we'll add to this file as we go, but for now I just want to define a string for this multiplayer setting. So I'm just going to call it RTS multiplayer, capitals generally. And I'm just going to call it game mode because that's the name of the text string that we're going to be after. So I'm going to, the option string, sorry. If you've never used defines before, it's basically saying you use this is what it's going to out. Copy this, come back to our option string and put that in there. I know where this is, and it's just included our static game data. If you hover over this, you can see it's just giving us the text game mode. All right, so if we do have the option string, we need to get the primary data asset. So we need to convert a string to an actual primary data asset ID. So the way we do that, get the string from the option string first. I call it game data from options, and we use the uGameplay statics again, function in there called pass option. Yep. Pass our option string, and we just use our define again. So that's going to retrieve our string from the game options, and then we need to assign it to our current game data asset ID. What we can do is we can create a primary asset ID and pass it so it needs two parameters to create a primary data asset. One is the name of the asset, sorry, the asset type, and then the name of the asset. So let's create another define for our data type, because we're probably gonna end up with a whole heap of data types. Section here, primary data asset types, define data asset type, and this one is going to be game data. And this one will be an F name, so F name, text, I'm just going to call it game data. So this is what we'll need to put in the asset manager when we get, because it's actually referencing a type that it has in its lookup table. This here. And then we need to get our game data from options string and put that in as a name. So that now gives us a legit game data asset ID. So let's now set up the fallback. So if we still don't have a current game data asset ID after checking the above, then we want to assign the, let's just copy this. We're going to assign a primary data asset ID. This time we don't have a string pass in, so what we're going to do is we're going to define a generic game data asset that we the default game data. Come in here, duplicate this one, and we'll just call it default. In here, we want to, this has to be the exact file name that it'll be in the editor for the actual physical data asset. I'm going to call it, I always name my data assets with DA. This is going to be a game data. So this is the type of data asset file that it is, game data, and I'm just going to call it default. Fine in here. If we ever have to use it again, we won't make a typo. So now we need to use the data, assuming it's valid. So let's do it again. So if it is valid, we want to do something. Not, and we want to log. What are we going to log? Let's actually create our own log category. So let's come into data again. I'm actually going to need CPPs for this. So I'm actually just going to go create Unreal class, and I'm just going to use an empty, and we'll just empty it out. But I'm going to call this RTS for debug data. I'm not going to need any of this. And what we want to do is, we'll need to include log macro. Okay, so now we can use the log macros. And then declare one, so we can go declare log category external and access it forever. And we'll just call it log RTS. I want it to be log all. And then in the CPP file, don't need any of it. We just want to define an category and the name of the reader. So now back in our game mode, and from 0, log our. So generally what I do here is to define what class it's logging from. So I'm going to do bracket and S, and then we can just say it has failed game data. Have a get in. So now we need a function to handle successful game data. So we'll create a function for that. One will be on game data. So now, once we've assigned the game data ID, we need to load that ID. We have to use the asset manager for this. We can use the static asset manager, get initialized. Now, if you're using an older version of Unreal Engine 5, I think get if initialized is a new thing in 2. Quote me on that. If you don't have get if initialized, use get if valid. I'm pretty sure it's the same thing. Maybe they've changed the name. I'm not sure. Maybe they've probably changed how it does something in the background, but be aware of that if you don't have it. If our current data asset ID valid, and we want to start loading it. So I'm just going to create an array for the bundles. We're not going to use the bundles, but I just need a param to stick in the call. We can probably just make it constant. Change it. Now we want to create our handle for when the game data is loaded. So we're looking for a streamable delegate and just call it loaded delegate. Delegate, and this is what we're going to, this is just binding to the delegate. So we're going to create a new object, this class, and then call it on game data loaded. Create that function. And then we load the game data. create this function here. There's something I need to check actually. I know with normal delegates you need U function, but I'm not sure if you do from the streamable. Maybe someone can answer that in the comments. I'm going to put it in now. I'll perhaps test it later. So now that our game data is loaded, we need to, what we want to do is assign the game data to our game state so we can replicate it and clients will have access to read the game data that's currently in use. So we're going to check that our game state is valid and our current data asset ID is valid. If they're both good, then we're going to cast to our type game state. So that's a game state. We either set the ID on the game state or we cast it to the game data U object and set that. I think I might do that because then anyone reading it doesn't have to cast it. Just the data will be available. Let's create a function to do that. Get game data. So this is the difference here I was talking about. This is game data itself, whereas before we're talking about game data ID. Think of an ID as just a pointer. This is the file that the game data is in. Now we need to get the game data out of that file. So again, I check that our ID is valid. We're going to need a reference to the asset manager. And then we just want to return the casted game data. So cast. Oh, we haven't actually created our game data actual class yet. But this will just be manager get data asset. We want the primary asset object. And then we pass it the data asset ID. So we need to create our data asset. And I think what I'm going to do is create a base class first and just put the primary data asset override in there. So I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to call this asset base. So this class will be for anything that applies to every single data asset. So in any plugin that we add and we create a data asset, we'll inherit from this base class. Abstract. So you just want to public in. We want to assign the property for the data type, defaults only, and read on, and we'll put a category on it, asset settings, data asset type. We'll just call it data type. So this will be a drop down in the asset to say what data type is, aka game data or over data. And now we just need to override the get primary asset ID function. And I'm just going to find this in place here. And this will add data asset ID, return that data type above. You can see this is a similar layout to what we were doing before when we were creating a primary data asset. We're passing the type and the name, and we just want to get the F name of this data asset. I'm hoping that will be working here. If not, we'll need to put this override in the child class. See how we go with that. Let's create another class here in the data folder. Game data. So I'm just prefixing asset on the end so I know it's base class. I'm going to inherit that from our data asset base. So now each time we inherit from that, we don't have to put those settings in there. And if there's anything else that's going to be in every data asset, we can put that in there. And then each data asset we create will just have the settings for whatever the data asset. So this one's going to be our game data. So we want it to have all the data for like displaying our game. So let's just start creating some variables here. And I'll call it category will display text, and I'll just call it map. That'll be the map name. Duplicate this, the game name. We'll have an image. Call it image actually. Image. name. We're going to need an actual field for the physical map. Put that at the top. Sorry, some of these will have to be, this will be the map ID, and this will be a primary data asset as well. Map asset objects are, we want to change up here, we want to add meta equal map. So that'll filter the options when you go to assign that to only types of map, which is levels. Weird naming mix-up, I think, there, but that's what it is. The actual data asset type, that's what's in the data asset registry, which I can show. Actually, I think I covered it in one of the videos, game mode. Oh, hang on, we've got to change this image from text. We're going to use a soft pointer. So if you haven't used soft pointers before, it just means that it's not loaded when this data asset is loaded. It will not load the actual texture. You have to manually load the texture. So that means we can load the data asset to read some data out of it. It means it won't load everything that this data asset points to. The display, let's make this map category. Display category, that's images display, that's fine. I need some variables here later. Great. I'm going to assign that to true, the default, and I'm going to create another. This one will be including games with. This will be when we create a UI to display the list game, and we don't want the default game to load, otherwise you'll start the game and it'll be the main menu is the game. So actually I might default this to false and that to true. But then when we create a new one for an actual game type, that'll be things. So the only one that we should have show menu will be the default one that we create. I think that'll do for now. Anything else we can back in it. So now we can put our type in here. We actually need to put that as the return type to make this the core data asset. Declaration for our data asset here. Should be all good. We can make it const. Messing with it. And this has to return null pointer. We bust out of this for any reason. And now assign the data. So if we manage to cast to our game data type, so we've got some valid data then, so we can now in the game say tell that to game data, and we'll pass it game data. Obviously I haven't created that function in the game state, but we can go do that now. Be a public. It'll need data asset or declaration or new game data. So before we do that, we need to define an actual property for it, and it's going to be replicated. Copy this. Game data. Start. So begin play. And then if it is a valid game data that comes through, double checking. Then we'll just say game data, new data. And that will trigger a replication. So now we need to bring in the replicated props. So I'm just going to copy this in. I usually always put the replicated thing underneath the constructor just so I can find it. And I don't want to and that just added some stuff to the header, I think. Yep, the net. And then in here we want to put our, I can just put this class, game data. So that'll replicate the game data to all the client game states. And you can see here it's saying this the variable hasn't been assigned anything. So our game data or null pointer construction. I get assigned by the game mode later. Now while we're here, I might just in here, I'm just going to put on game data loaded. So this will be a function where the game state can do anything it needs to do when the game data is loaded. Leaves a new one. Create that function. I think we need to do anything in here. So we'll just put on the server and the game data. It's all ready to go when we do need it. So that's the core of our game data setup. In the next part, we're going to look at starting on our game phase system.